everybody's visiting, but it is a few minutes. It's 5 after, which means it's time to start. That's about starting time usually. We even had a little bit of a grace period this morning. We had a strange problem with the computer where it just totally locked up, and so we had to get that rebooted. It seems to be working now, which is good. But at any rate, at some point we got to get going here, and so we'll begin our class now. We're continuing what we started last week, and what we're really doing here for just the last few weeks at the end of the year until we really dig into a new big study, doing some of these little vignettes, these little character studies of individuals to see what sort of practical lessons we might be able to take from them. And in some ways, the one last week builds on and is related, or the one this week builds on and is related to the one last week. You think about the Apostle Paul. Paul was extraordinarily gifted. He had dynamic abilities, and that made him a force in the expansion, the growth, really the explosive growth of the early church. He is, as we know, really the foremost figure in its formative years, especially in terms of the Gentile expansion of the church. But as gifted as he was, Paul is still only one man, and he still has all the space-time physical limitations that any one human being does. And beyond that, he knows he won't be around forever. The church not only needs more people in addition to him in his lifetime, but it's going to need other younger leaders to be able to step up if it's going to continue to grow and to flourish. And to accomplish that, then, he took young men under his wing to sort of serve as apprentices, to help train them to be able to carry on that task after he was gone. We encounter many young men like that in his letters, and in fact, Mark, who we looked at last week, was one of those. Despite that rocky start, he ended up having a really warm and effective relationship with Paul towards the end of his life. Well, we want to look at two others this morning that we probably associate together in terms of their names, and those are Timothy and Titus. Names that we know well, but a couple of men that perhaps we don't think very much about or know a lot about, I would think in Titus's case in particular. If you think back to the book of Acts and just walk your way through it, starting there in chapter 7 and in chapter 8 then, Stephen is killed in Jerusalem. He's the first Christian martyr. And after his death, the disciples are scattered from Jerusalem. Now you remember they go everywhere preaching the word. And as a result, unwittingly, this is one of those great examples of how God takes those who are trying to fight against him and he actually turns it around and uses it for good. Before, the church was thriving there in Jerusalem, but it was essentially local. Well, now persecution comes, and that seems bad, and yet God uses it for good, because now the gospel begins to spread. And one of the places that these disciples went to was the city of Antioch in Syria, which was one of the most important cities in the first century world. They established a church there, a church which eventually consisted of both Jews and Gentiles who were converted to Christ. And when the apostles, who were still down in Jerusalem, hear about this, they send Barnabas. You remember Barnabas. Barnabas played a prominent role in our story last week. They send Barnabas up to Antioch to sort of investigate, see what's going on, and fitting with his name, to encourage them, to help build them up there and instruct those new believers. And that's when Barnabas decided for the first time to enlist Saul to help him in his mission. That's in Acts chapter 11, verses 25 and 26. And as we know, for really most of the rest of Acts, Peter appears again in chapter 12, and then he basically goes off stage. For much of the rest of Acts, we will find Saul, or Paul, as we come to know him better, prominently associated with the church in Antioch in particular. It's from there, as we saw last week, that he and Barnabas set off on that first missionary journey. That's the beginning of Acts chapter 13, when the Spirit says to the church there that's assembled to set apart Paul and Barnabas for the work that they've been chosen for. And that's when they decide to take Mark with them. But on that journey, we saw the beginning of this last week, that they passed through a number of different cities and regions, particularly in the south of modern-day Turkey. They go from Cyprus, and then they go up to Antioch in Pisidia, a different Antioch from the one they were sent out from. But they go through Pisidian Antioch, through Iconium, that's chapter 14. Ultimately, they wind up then finally in the region of Lycaonia, in the cities of Lystra and Derbe. Once they arrive there, Paul goes about his usual practice, which is, of course, anytime he goes into a new city, he immediately starts preaching Jesus. And the first place he usually goes is the synagogue, if there's a synagogue in the city. There's no mention of any synagogue here. And so instead, we find Paul in the marketplace, where he encounters a lame man, and he heals him and proclaims Jesus to him. Well, eventually, that Jewish opposition, even though there's no synagogue mentioned, there evidently is enough Jews to grow in opposition there. It could be some of these that are following him around, and actually it is. Some, at least from Antioch and then from Iconium, come down and they stir people up. And eventually it gets so intense that in Lystra, Paul is stoned, and he's left there for dead. But he survives. And that's when he heads to Derbe, which was just a few miles away, before passing through Lystra again on his return journey. Derbe's sort of the end point, and then they go back through all the cities that they hit the first time on their way back home, and ultimately to Jerusalem for the council. But in his wake, he leaves two young Christian communities there in those cities, quite likely including a couple of recent converts, a woman named Lois, along with her daughter Eunice. And Eunice had a son, a boy named Timothy. And that's who we want to talk about first of all today. If you look in 2 Timothy, Paul in that letter gives us at least glimpses of Timothy's early life. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse number 5, Paul says, "I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now, I'm sure, dwells in you as well." You could look again at chapter 3, verse 14. He says, "As for you, continue in what you've learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it and how from childhood you've been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ." So Paul reminds Timothy of his faith that was first instilled in him as a child, because that faith was first held by his mother and by his grandmother. Those two good women had instructed Timothy in the Old Testament scriptures ever since he was a boy. That's what Paul says in chapter 3 there. And it was that instruction. Remember, when he talks there about being instructed in the scriptures, they didn't have a New Testament at this point. We're talking here about the Old Testament. But that instruction in scripture is what prepared Timothy's heart for Jesus, because he'd learned about what God had done in the past. He'd learned about the promises of the Messiah, and he was looking for him, and so were his mother and grandmother. And when Paul came preaching Jesus, they received that message, and it grew there. Long before Paul ever arrived in Derbe, Timothy had already been instructed in God's will and God's word, and he had already been prepared to receive this message about Jesus. It was just filling in the gaps in his knowledge. It was just completing that instruction that had already been begun by his mother and his grandmother. And evidently, even though Paul left that region, Derbe and Lystra, Paul went back to Jerusalem, but Timothy evidently continued to grow, continued to learn, continued to mature in his absence, and I think we can imagine that no doubt his mother and his grandmother, Lois and Eunice, helped him along in this as well. But that brings us to our next glimpse of Timothy in Acts. This is several years later. And you remember Paul and Barnabas had the falling out. So Barnabas and Mark go one way, and Paul chooses a new traveling companion, Silas. And he retraces his steps from that first missionary journey. And once again, he comes then to Timothy's hometown of Derbe. Acts chapter 16, verse 1, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Timothy is, I would imagine, known to Paul from his first missionary journey. But remember, several years have passed. He's grown up. And we always, when we think of Timothy we talk about young Timothy, we think of him as this child, and he is a young man, but by now he's possibly in his mid-20s here when he begins to set out with Paul. So he's a young man. The Romans really didn't consider you to have reached full maturity until you were 40 years old. In our society, we kind of look down, you're over the hill, man. But the Romans thought, well, you'd just really arrived because you still had some physical strength, but also you had the wisdom that you'd acquired from adulthood. So really at 40, that's when in the Republic, for instance, you were first eligible to be a consul because they thought you were fit to now be in charge of things. So when we talk about young Timothy, he's 20, 25 years old here at this point. But he was well spoken of by all the Christians here in this area, and Paul sees here a young man who is qualified to join his team. He probably sees a lot of potential in this fellow, because not only is he well-versed in the Scriptures, we know that, we've read that already. Not only is he someone of fine, upstanding character, because all the brothers speak well of him, but also he comes from this mixed ethnic background. His mother was a Jew, and his father was a Gentile. For the type of ministry that Paul is doing, sort of straddling both of these worlds, Timothy is an ideal helper because he can walk in both of those worlds. He can be conversant in the synagogue and with Jewish tradition, but Timothy knows something of Gentile life and Gentile customs. That combination will enable him to naturally access both of those cultures. In fact, he probably feels more at home among Gentiles than Paul does, because his father is one. So that's an invaluable resource when Paul's trying to reach both Jews and Gentiles. And so Paul asks Timothy to join his missionary team. Verse 3, Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him. And he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. I want you to remember that, because we'll come back to that idea in a moment. But Timothy will spend the next 15 plus years working much of the time side by side with Paul, and then sometimes being entrusted on his own missions, proving himself to be faithful, proving himself to be loyal. And I want us to just, when we read through Acts and when we read through Paul's letters, we're primarily looking at the story in Acts with him as the protagonist in the second half of the book. We read his letters naturally through his eyes, since he's the writer. But I want us to think about the mentions of Timothy and sort of trace his steps here. First of all, here in chapter 16, he travels with Paul to Philippi. And it's there in that very first stop that he begins to display both his devotion to Paul and his evangelistic zeal. Paul mentions him in his letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verse 22. He says, "You know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served me in the gospel." That's the very first stop he makes, and from the beginning, the Philippians saw that he proved his worth. And from there, if you keep reading through Acts, Paul travels through several cities, most prominently Thessalonica, Berea. When trouble erupts in Berea, because they didn't like him in Thessalonica, so they chase him from Thessalonica down to Berea. The Bereans had received the word pretty gladly. When trouble breaks out there, then in the second half of Acts 17, Paul moves to Athens. Meanwhile, Silas and Timothy are evidently left behind in Berea for a short time to continue to help build up that church. Acts 17:14, the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. So Paul goes on to Athens, Timothy remains behind, but eventually he and Silas arrive with Paul there in Athens. And at that point, Paul determines to send Timothy on an independent mission. I assume it's at least in part because he'd proved himself there somewhat working, Paul's gone, and he works there effectively with just Silas. Well, now Timothy's shown that he can be trusted to go and handle something independently. So in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, we see that Paul sends Timothy back there to Thessalonica, where they'd been run out of previously, to help the church out there. It's notable because that's his first solo assignment, but it's not going to be his last one. You go back to Acts, and you see that he travels back to meet up with Paul in Corinth, which is a major city south of Athens there, on the isthmus there. When Silas, this is Acts 18:5, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul, already in Corinth, was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And it's likely from Corinth, most scholars think, that Paul wrote those letters back to Thessalonica. And Silas and Timothy are both mentioned in the salutations of those letters at the very beginning. We don't have another mention of Timothy then for about 5 years. It's hard for us to tell it's 5 years in Acts because Luke doesn't always give us chronological cues, but you put it together. And it's about 5 years later in Acts chapter 19 when he's sent from Ephesus to Greece to prepare for Paul's coming. Verse number 22, having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. And from there he travels with Paul down to Corinth, where Paul likely writes the letter to the Romans. Romans chapter 16, verse 21, mentioned there. The next time that Timothy is mentioned, it's with Paul in Rome during his imprisonment. We know that from those prison epistles. He's associated with a lot of those. Paul will mention the fact that he's with him, or he'll mention him at other points there. In fact, we don't know for sure, but traditionally, Timothy's said to be the amanuensis for those prison letters. That's just means that he was the one who wrote it down. Paul dictated it and Timothy wrote it, at least according to tradition. But you remember that Paul was released from imprisonment the first time that he's held in jail there in Rome. At least that's what's most likely. And he travels then with Timothy, where he leaves Timothy in Ephesus. This is outside of Acts now. The book of Acts is concluded, but this is 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 3. Paul says to Timothy, as I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus, so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. So Paul's released from Roman prison. Timothy had been there with him. He goes to Ephesus, and he leaves Timothy behind there because Timothy has a really important job to do. Not only, it's mentioned there explicitly to charge them not to teach any different doctrine. But you read through the beginning of 1 Timothy, and there's evidently a lot of problems in Ephesus. False doctrine, there's disorder, there are leadership troubles. Paul really writes these two letters to Timothy largely to deal with those issues. One of the things that Timothy needs to do is to help set the eldership in order there in Ephesus because it's so problematic. But not too long after this first letter, a second letter comes. This one written again from a Roman prison. Paul is back in jail. He's soon to be martyred, and you probably remember the end of this letter. We actually looked at part of it last week. One of those personal sections in all of Paul's letters, but he asked Timothy to come just as soon as possible. 2 Timothy 4, verse 9, do your best to come to me soon. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he's very useful to me for ministry. Tychicus I've sent to Ephesus. We don't know if Timothy made it there or not. Paul's virtually all alone except for Luke. I like to think that he did. Paul has these other requests. You remember to bring the cloak I left with Carpus, and bring the books and the parchments. It seems likely that Timothy was somewhat timid by nature. If you reading between the lines, it talks about how he needs to stir up the gift that's in him to fulfill his ministry. His youthfulness didn't help him in that regard either. If you go back to 1 Timothy chapter 4, and a passage that most of us probably know, where he says to, verse 12, chapter 4, verse 12, let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Again, when we say let no one despise your youth, Timothy was probably pushing 40 by the time that this was written. But in the Gentile world, still would have been considered a young man, and someone that people don't necessarily listen to. But he overcame those obstacles. He became a valuable co-worker with Paul. And we know that after Paul's death, Timothy alone was imprisoned at least once. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 23, the Hebrews writer mentions that our brother Timothy has just recently been released from prison. By tradition, he continued to work there. He labored the rest of his life in and around Ephesus, where he was eventually martyred under the Emperor Domitian in the 90s. We know a good bit about Timothy, his life, his circumstances. We don't know nearly as much about about Titus. If you look at Galatians chapter 2, what we do know about Titus is that he was a Gentile, whereas Timothy comes from a mixed parentage. Titus evidently is a Greek believer who was trained by Paul. Galatians 2 verse 1, Paul says, after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Now, we can imagine Paul's talking about going down to Jerusalem here for the council. He's talking about the controversy that erupted in Antioch. So we don't know for sure, but Titus was most likely from Antioch, where that controversy erupted. And he joins Paul and Barnabas as a sort of test case. He's Exhibit A here in this Gentile mission and concerning what requirements need to be placed on Gentiles for salvation, because you know there were quite a few people who were arguing that Gentiles effectively needed to become Jews before they could become Christians. They needed to be circumcised, they needed to keep the law, but Paul argues that that shouldn't be a requirement for Gentiles. But I told you to keep in mind earlier, Timothy, he has circumcised. Titus, he takes as this test case, adamant that he should not be circumcised. What do you think accounts for that difference? This is a thought question, sort of by the way, but I'm curious if anybody has any idea on what the distinction is between Timothy and Titus. Of Titus compared to Timothy? Yeah, I think that exactly gets at it. Titus is a Greek. Both of Titus's parents are Gentiles. And Paul is adamant that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. They don't need to keep the law in order to be Christians. But Timothy is from a mixed background. His mother's a Jew. So, in other words, Timothy can walk in both worlds, like we talked about. And even though he doesn't have to be circumcised, and wasn't before, as a matter of salvation, Paul circumcises him, as it says there in Acts chapter 16, on account of the Jews who knew he wasn't, so that he could go in those places where only Jews were allowed to go. I think that's exactly right. But it's something worth keeping in mind. Why circumcise one and not the other? Well, it has to do in part with Paul, as he says, becoming all things to all people. This is a matter of expediency for his ministry. Timothy can go into those Jewish places. But Titus, as a Gentile through and through, he's not going to place any burden on him. He wants to make it clear that you don't need to keep the law in order to become a Christian, in order to be saved. That's the distinction. I think you're right on, Ken. That's the way I've always interpreted that as well. But at any rate, Titus then becomes a trusted friend, a traveling companion of Paul. And one great example of this is Titus's work in Corinth, which is something we just cobbled together, reading between the lines, piecing parts of 2 Corinthians in particular together. If you remember anything about the church in Corinth, it's a church that was just racked with all sorts of different problems. I don't think it's a stretch to call it dysfunctional, which in some ways should be an encouragement to us because, hey, this is a church with a lot of problems, and yet Paul still says they're saints. They're called by God. They don't cease to be Christians because of that. But you remember they had sexual immorality they tolerated there. They had factionalism. They had abuses of the Lord's Supper. They had brothers going to court and suing each other. On and on the problems go here. Timothy worked with Paul there, addressing those issues of concern. We saw that already. But then Paul sends Titus there. He sends him from Ephesus to Corinth with the letter of 2 Corinthians. And if you flip to 2 Corinthians, in fact, Titus had actually already worked some with the church there, which prompted Paul's letter. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 12, Paul says, "When I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was open for me in the Lord, my spirit was not at rest, because I didn't find my brother Titus there. So I took leave of them and went on to Macedonia." Now, fast forward to chapter 7, verse 15, this long personal section here. Let's start in verse 5. Paul says, "Even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted at every turn, fighting without and fear within. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted by you, as he told us of your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoice still more. For even if I made you grieve with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I see that letter grieved you, though only for a while. As it is, I rejoice, not because you were grieved, but because you were grieved into repenting. For you felt a godly grief, so that you suffered no loss through us. For godly grief produces a repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death. For see what earnestness this godly grief has produced in you, but also what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what longing, what zeal, what punishment. At every point you've proved yourselves innocent in the matter. So although I wrote to you, it was not for the sake of the one who did the wrong, nor for the sake of the one who suffered the wrong, but in order that your earnestness for us might be revealed to you in the sight of God. Therefore we are comforted. And besides our own comfort, we rejoice still more at the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all. For whatever boast I made to him about you, I wasn't put to shame. But just as everything we said to you was true, so also our boasting before Titus has proved true. And his affection for you is even greater, as he remembers the obedience of you all, how you received him with fear and trembling. I rejoice because I have complete confidence in you. So we put all this together. Titus was entrusted with an extremely important mission. He carried this letter to the church in Corinth, this letter of tears, as it's been called, a letter that's evidently been lost to us. And Paul thought it didn't have any effect. But then when he finally meets up with Titus, Titus brings news that it worked, that they repented. And then ultimately, if you go to chapter 8, you see in verse number 16 that thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he is going to you of his own accord. And you could continue reading. The discussion really goes down through verse number 24, but Titus delivered the letter, brings news that it had its intended effect. Some of those problems addressed in 1 Corinthians have been remedied. There's been repentance. And now Titus is going back to Corinth to sort of deal with some of those other problems that are continuing to simmer there. But what's so awesome about this is he goes of his own initiative. Paul doesn't even have to ask him to go. He wants to go because he cares about them. He's concerned, and he knows things still aren't quite right there, so he goes to continue to work with him, and Paul says he's doing that of his own accord. Finally, last glimpse we have of Titus. This is from the letter that Paul writes to him. Paul trusted Titus enough to leave him on Crete. And this is beginning in chapter 1 there. We won't read the whole book, obviously, for time's sake, but Titus is given this task on Crete of strengthening these churches that have been newly planted there. And Crete was plagued with immoral people. As we know, Paul quotes here from Epimenides, his paradox. One of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. They have a reputation there in the ancient world. So this is not an easy task that he's given to set the church in order. But in Paul's eyes, Titus is the man for the job. He's up for this task. So he orders him, first of all, verse 5, this is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. That's his first job. All the churches that have been established there in the various different towns of Crete, he needs to make sure that they have elders who are appointed there. And he instructs Titus then in the importance of right conduct and how he needs to pass that instruction on. So the upshot of this, the overall picture, is of a faithful and skilled young associate of Paul. Just like we saw with Timothy, Titus is given difficult assignments on Crete, in Corinth. But he was another man on whom Paul could completely rely to handle those tasks. In fact, interestingly, Timothy was the one who was sent carrying that first letter to the church in Corinth. So evidently, Timothy in some way failed to get any sort of response. Titus succeeded. And I don't say that as a poor reflection on Timothy, as much as these are two different men, two different styles. We don't know what went on, but Titus achieved some results. He achieved repentance there with Paul's letters when Timothy didn't. But the point is, both of these men were men on whom Paul could rely to complete these most troubling of tasks. So what are some practical takeaways from these two young men? The thing we want to look at here, just the last 5 minutes. First of all, we need to realize the importance of training the next generation of leaders in the church, something we hit on somewhat last week. Paul was a trainer of men. He recognized how vital that task was, and he sent many of them out. And there were others besides Timothy and Titus, some we've encountered in passing here. Tychicus is one. Luke is another. Mark, whom we looked at last week. Paul knew he wouldn't be around forever. He knew the church needed others to be able to carry on his work. And so the question for us is, are we busy about doing that same sort of work? Are we following in those footsteps? Are we keen on training the next generation of Christian leaders? Now that could be with our what we call young people, children, teenagers, things like that. Certainly they need to be trained, but remember that young is relative. When we're talking about Timothy, when he sets out with Paul, he's 20, 25 years old. By the time he writes that last letter to him, when he's instructing him there, Timothy's 40 years old, and Paul still sees him as a young man who needs some training, who needs to continue to grow and be nurtured. So do we continue to grow and nurture that next generation, those who are going to be deacons or elders in the church? Or if we're talking about young women, those who are going to be Bible class teachers, things like that. We need to look for those opportunities to mold and shape those people. How, whether we're talking about children or teenagers or people in their 20s or 30s, how are they going to learn? How are they going to grow if we don't try to help them along, help identify, help nurture them, help them to mature? Secondly, reliability is essential for service. Reliability is essential for service. Timothy and Titus, as we've seen, had a profound impact on the early church, and because of their influence, churches took root, churches grew, elderships were established, churches were able to hash out problems. They were such strong and dedicated servants that Paul could rely on them independently to go out and complete tasks. He knew they could be depended upon to do the job that was given to them. So the question for us is, how reliable am I? Can people in the church count on me to do what I say I'm going to do? Can we be given tasks to be carried out? Could the elders ask us to do something the way that Paul asked Timothy and Titus to do things? Faithfulness and reliability are hallmarks of spiritual maturity. We can have a great influence on others in the church. We might think that we don't have a ton of talents, a ton of abilities, but we can have a great influence just by being reliable and dependable, just by showing up, just by doing what needs to be done when no one else will do it. And finally, and this is on a more personal note, but I always think of this with Timothy and Titus, or with Timothy in particular, and you probably do too. Remember the role of family, of parents and of grandparents in spiritual development. You talk about training that next generation. Well, it's obvious how influential Lois and Eunice were in Timothy's growth and development. They had a true and a genuine faith. They instructed him from the time he was a child in the Scriptures. As a parent or as a grandparent, because in particular we've got a lot of grandparents in here, you have a tremendous influence when it comes to spiritual matters. So you need, like Lois and Eunice, to make sure that you have a real and a genuine faith, not just a Sunday morning faith that you put on here and then you don't live out, don't demonstrate the rest of the week. Make sure that yours is lived out on a daily basis in front of your children, your grandchildren, just the way that they did. Make sure that you make an effort to instruct them in the Scriptures the way that they did. That's the greatest help that you can give them as they struggle towards spiritual growth. And as we've seen in a number of ways this morning, that is vital, not only for those individual youngsters in particular, but it's vital for the growth and the development and the health of the church as a whole. And that puts us just about out of time. Anybody with a question or a comment or anything at this point? All right. Thanks for your attention this morning.